The trauma unit at St. Aurelia Medical Center had never been known for silence, but on that storm-heavy evening, the noise seemed sharper than usual. Phones rang without pause. Wheels of stretchers rattled across polished floors. Nurses moved quickly between stations, speaking in clipped voices that barely hid the tension in their faces. Outside, rain struck the hospital windows in steady waves. The city had been dealing with a major highway pileup for the past 2 hours, and every emergency room within 30 miles had been pushed to its limit. St. Aurelia, one of the region's top trauma centers, was carrying more than its share. Inside Trauma Bay 3, alarms sounded from multiple monitors as staff worked around 2 incoming patients at once. A respiratory therapist called for additional supplies. Someone else shouted for lab results. The overhead speaker announced another ambulance arrival. It was the kind of night that exposed every weakness in a system, and everyone knew it. At the center of it all stood Chief Surgeon Dr. Elias Rowan. He was known throughout the hospital for his precision and his impossible standards. Tall, sharp-eyed, and rarely seen without a tense expression, he had built his reputation on handling the cases no one else wanted to touch. But tonight, even he looked strained. "Where is the additional trauma support?" he snapped as he removed a pair of gloves and reached for another. A nurse avoided his eyes. "We're still waiting for 2 staff transfers from county. They should have been here 20 minutes ago." Another alarm rang. A young resident approached him with a chart in trembling hands. "Doctor, the second patient's pressure is dropping." Dr. Rowan barely glanced at the chart before moving. "Prepper 2. Now." The team scattered. He stepped into the hallway, jaw tight, already thinking 3 cases ahead. That was when he saw her. She stood near the supply station, not speaking, not rushing, simply observing. At first glance, she didn't seem unusual. She wore a plain dark medical vest over standard hospital scrubs. Her hair was tied back neatly, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. No jewelry, no unnecessary accessories. But what stood out most was her stillness. In a corridor filled with motion and urgency, she seemed untouched by the storm around her. She wasn't frozen. She was calm, completely, unnervingly calm. Dr. Rowan frowned. He had worked in trauma medicine for nearly 20 years. He had seen every kind of personality under pressure. Panic, aggression, denial, overconfidence. But this was different. She carried herself like someone who had already lived through worse. He walked toward her. "Are you with the transfer team?" he asked sharply. She turned to face him. Her expression remained steady. "Yes." Just one word. Her voice was low and clear. Dr. Rowan looked her over. "Name?" "Leona Vale." He scanned his memory. He had not heard of her. "You're late." The roads were blocked. No excuse in her tone. Just fact. He crossed his arms. "Do you have trauma certification?" "Yes." "How current?" "Active." The answers came without hesitation. Still calm. Still unreadable. He narrowed his eyes. Around them, chaos continued. A nurse hurried past carrying blood units. 2 orderlies pushed a stretcher toward imaging. But Leona Vale stood like the center of a quiet circle. It irritated him. "You're very composed," he said. She met his gaze. "Yes." That answer only deepened his frustration. Most people would have explained themselves, offered reassurance, tried to prove something. She did none of that. Dr. Rowan stepped closer. "You understand what kind of night this is?" "I do. And yet you look like you're waiting for a train." A pause. Then she said, almost gently, "Staying calm helps people survive." The sentence hit harder than he expected. For a brief moment he had no response. Before he could say anything else, a nurse rushed toward them. "Doctor, Bay 2 needs another set of hands immediately." He looked between the nurse and Leona, then made a quick decision. "You," he said to Leona, "come with me." She followed without question. Inside Bay 2, the atmosphere was tight and urgent. A middle-aged man lay on the table, oxygen mask secured, monitors flashing unstable readings. Staff moved around him with increasing concern. Dr. Rowan stepped in immediately. "Status?" Severe internal bleeding suspected. Pressure unstable. He nodded once, then turned. Leona had already moved toward the patient. Not hurriedly, not aggressively, just with focused purpose. She checked the monitor, adjusted the line placement, then placed one hand lightly on the patient's shoulder as she spoke to him. "Stay with us. Keep breathing slowly." The man's panic seemed to ease. It was subtle but noticeable. Dr. Rowan watched her. Her movements were efficient, practiced, and completely controlled. No wasted effort. No uncertainty. One nurse reached for the wrong instrument tray. Leona corrected it before the mistake happened. Another staff member hesitated over dosage confirmation. She verified it instantly, not loudly, not dramatically, just precisely. Within minutes, the room's energy began to shift. The panic softened. The work became coordinated. It was as if her calm had spread to everyone around her. Dr. Rowan found himself studying her more closely. Who was this woman? Because she was clearly more than an emergency transfer. As she reached for a fresh set of gloves, the side of her vest shifted slightly. And that was when he saw it. Patch. Small. Worn at the edges. Dark thread against darker fabric. At first, he only noticed it because it looked older than the vest itself. Then his eyes focused, and his entire body went still. The room blurred for half a second. He knew that patch. He knew it. A circular emblem, partly faded, stitched with deliberate care. Not military exactly, not civilian either. A symbol tied to a medical response unit so selective that most people in healthcare had never even heard of it. A unit built for disaster zones, high-risk missions, and impossible rescue conditions. A unit that had quietly operated where systems failed. Dr. Rowan stared. No, that couldn't be right. He took a step closer. Leona looked up. For the first time, his voice lost its edge. "Where did you get that?" She glanced down briefly at the patch, then back at him. "It's mine." Something in her tone suggested the answer should be obvious. But to Dr. Rowan, it only raised more questions. Because that patch was not something you bought, borrowed, or inherited casually. It was earned. And very few ever did. He opened his mouth to ask more. But the monitor alarm surged. The patient's numbers dropped sharply. Instinct took over. Leona was already moving. Pressure falling. Increased support. Her voice cut through the room with quiet authority. Everyone responded instantly. Even Dr. Rowan. For the next 10 minutes, they worked side by side. And despite every complication, they stabilized the patient. When it was over, the room finally exhaled. A nurse stepped back and whispered, "We've got him." Relief spread through the team. Dr. Rowan removed his gloves slowly, then looked at Leona again. She was wiping her hands, expression unchanged, as if the last 10 minutes had been routine, as if nothing about the night had surprised her. He had seen elite professionals before. But this level of composure, this complete emotional control under pressure was rare, almost unsettling. The patch on her vest now felt heavier in his mind than before. He approached her once more. "You didn't mention prior field service." She looked at him. "You didn't ask." That answer should have annoyed him. Instead, it unsettled him. Because she was right. And because she had spoken with the certainty of someone who had no interest in impressing anyone. He folded his arms. "What exactly is your background, Ms. Vale?" For the first time, there was a slight pause. Then she said, "Emergency medicine. That's too broad." "It usually is." Their eyes held. He realized then that she was measuring him as much as he was measuring her. A strange silence passed between them. Before either could continue, another emergency call came over the intercom. The night was far from over. Leona turned toward the sound. "Ready." Dr. Rowan watched her for 1 second longer, then followed. But as he moved down the hallway, one thought stayed fixed in his mind. That patch. He had not seen it in over a decade. And if she truly belonged to the unit he suspected, then Leona Vale was not just another transfer nurse. She was someone with a history far deeper than anyone in that hospital realized. And somehow, on the busiest night of the year, She had walked through their doors as if fate had sent her there. Dr. Rowan had spent years believing he had seen every kind of professional under pressure. But as the storm raged outside and the trauma unit prepared for another wave of emergencies, he understood one thing with growing certainty. The calmest person in the building was also the one carrying the biggest mystery, and he intended to find out why. The storm outside had not eased. Rain continued to strike the windows in long, restless waves, and every few minutes thunder rolled across the city like a distant warning. Inside St. Aurelia Medical Center, the trauma unit remained under pressure. But something had changed. The staff still moved quickly, the alarms still sounded, and incoming cases still arrived one after another. But the energy in the department had shifted ever so slightly. People were watching Leona Vale. Not openly, not enough to interfere with their work, but in stolen glances and half-second pauses. Word traveled fast in hospitals, especially on nights when something unusual broke the rhythm. And Leona was unusual. No one knew exactly who she was, but everyone had seen how she worked. The way she entered a room and immediately understood what mattered. The way her voice never rose, even when others began to unravel. The way she could steady not only a patient, but the people around them. Some admired it. Others distrusted it. Chief among them was Dr. Elias Rowan. He had not taken his eyes off her for long since Bay 2. The patch on her vest kept replaying in his thoughts. That faded symbol. That impossible connection. He had spent years burying memories of a certain field unit, one tied to a chapter of his career he rarely discussed. And yet here it was again, stitched quietly to the side of a transfer nurse's vest as if it meant nothing. He needed answers. But before he could confront her again, another emergency case pulled everyone into motion. A young woman had arrived after collapsing during the storm. She was conscious but weak, her condition worsening by the minute. Leona entered the room with the others. Dr. Rowan observed as she assessed the patient without hesitation. The woman was frightened, barely able to answer questions. A nurse attempted to calm her, but panic only increased. Then Leona leaned in. Her tone softened. She spoke in a steady rhythm. Simple words, direct eye contact, one hand resting lightly near the patient's arm. Within moments, the woman's breathing slowed. Her shoulders relaxed. The room seemed to settle. Again, Dr. Rowan noticed it as clearly as before. This was not just training. It was instinct sharpened by experience. And it was beginning to bother him. Because no one became this composed without having seen things most people never should. After the patient was stabilized and transferred for further scans, Dr. Rowan finally intercepted Leona in the hallway. He closed the door behind them. The corridor outside remained loud, but in the small supply room, there was only the hum of overhead lights. Leona faced him without tension. Dr. Rowan studied her for a moment. Then he spoke. "You've worked in high-pressure environments before." She gave a small nod. "Yes. That patch confirms it." She glanced down briefly at the edge of her vest. He continued, "You understand why I'm asking. I understand your curiosity. It's more than curiosity." For the first time, his tone carried something less sharp, something closer to concern. "That symbol belongs to a medical response unit with an almost non-existent public record. I know because I encountered them years ago." Leona remained silent. Dr. Rowan stepped closer. "So I'll ask directly. Were you part of that team?" A pause stretched between them. Then she answered, "Yes." No denial. No dramatic reveal. Just one word. And yet it hit the room like a weight. Dr. Rowan stared at her. The confirmation unsettled him more than he expected. Because now there was no doubt. She had served in one of the most demanding emergency medical operations ever assembled. A unit that was called only when ordinary systems collapsed. A unit whose members rarely returned to standard hospital work. And if they did, they never talked about it. He searched her face. "You're younger than I expected." Leona almost smiled, but not quite. "People often say that. Why leave?" Her eyes shifted for the first time. Not away from him, just toward the floor for a second. "When it was time." That answer told him nothing. And somehow everything. Dr. Rowan crossed his arms. You've been here less than 2 hours. And already half the department is trying to understand you. That sounds exhausting. That nearly caught him off guard. For a second, despite himself, he let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. Then his expression hardened again. You know what I meant. I do. Silence returned. Then he said it. You're too composed. This time the words were quieter than before. More observation than accusation. Leona met his gaze steadily. Would you rather I panic? That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? He hesitated, because he wasn't entirely sure. He had spent his career pushing emotion aside, believing control was necessary to survive medicine. But Leona's version of calm was different. It wasn't detachment. It was something deeper, something earned. And it made him uncomfortable because it reflected a kind of strength he had once admired, and perhaps lost. You act like nothing affects you, he finally said. Leona considered that, then answered carefully. Everything affects me. The words landed softly, but they carried truth. She adjusted one glove in her hand. The difference is what I choose to carry where others can see it. Dr. Rowan had no reply. Before either could continue, a nurse opened the supply room door. Doctor, we need you in trauma 4. He stepped aside. Leona moved toward the exit. As she passed him, he noticed the patch again. And this time, something beneath it caught his eye. A stitched line of text so faded it was nearly unreadable. He reached instinctively. Wait! She stopped. He leaned closer. There, under the symbol, were 2 words. Not a rank. Not a unit code. A phrase. A motto. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to the same field team he had once seen in action overseas during a humanitarian deployment. A phrase spoken only among them. One he had not heard in years. His expression changed. Leona noticed. And for the first time that night, a flicker of understanding crossed her face. She knew he recognized it. That realization shifted something between them. No longer stranger and superior. Now there was shared history, however distant. You've seen it before, she said. Dr. Rowan nodded slowly. Only once. Her voice lowered. Then you understand. He did. At least enough to know that the patch was not decoration. It was memory, responsibility, and likely grief. The room felt smaller. He took a step back. Why keep wearing it? Her answer came immediately. So I remember who I was when it mattered most. That sentence stayed with him. Before he could ask more, another call came over the speaker. Leona turned toward the hallway. Duty first. And then she was gone. Dr. Rowan stood still for a moment longer. Outside, the department continued moving. But inside him, something had shifted. He had approached her expecting arrogance, mystery, maybe even hidden ambition. Instead, he had found discipline wrapped in humility. And beneath it all, something unspoken. A past she carried without display. As he returned to the trauma floor, he noticed the staff watching her differently now. Not because they knew the truth, but because they could sense what he finally understood. Leona Vale was not pretending to be strong. She simply was. And whatever had shaped her had left marks deeper than anyone there could see. The storm outside continued through the night. But within those hospital walls, another kind of tension had begun to build. Because if one faded patch could change the expression of the hospital's most respected surgeon, then the story behind it had to be far greater than anyone imagined. By midnight, the worst of the emergency rush had finally begun to ease. The waiting rooms were still full, and the trauma board remained crowded, but the relentless flood of ambulance arrivals had slowed enough for people to breathe between cases. Staff moved with the kind of tired focus that came only after hours of nonstop pressure. Coffee cups sat abandoned at workstations. Jackets were draped over chairs. Conversations had shifted from urgent commands to quieter updates. But one subject kept surfacing in hushed tones. Leona Vale. No one spoke about her directly when she was nearby, but questions passed from nurse to nurse, resident to resident. Where had she trained? Why had Dr. Rowan stopped challenging her? And most of all, what was the meaning of that patch? The symbol had become impossible to ignore once people noticed the way Dr. Rowan looked at it. He had gone from suspicion to something that resembled respect. And in a place where his approval was rare, that change carried weight. Leona, meanwhile, acted as if none of it existed. She moved through the department with the same measured pace, helping where needed, never seeking attention. She restocked supplies between patients, checked in on a recovering family in observation, sat beside an elderly man whose test results had been delayed, and quietly explained every next step until his hands stopped trembling. No one could quite place her role anymore. She wasn't just trauma support. She became something else entirely. A steady force that made difficult nights easier to bear. Near 1 a.m, Dr. Rowan found her alone in the staff lounge, standing by the vending machine. For once, there were no alarms, no rushed footsteps, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of rain against distant windows. She held a paper cup of tea. He closed the door behind him. Leona glanced over, unsurprised. "Chief surgeon in the lounge," she said lightly. "That can't be a good sign." "It depends who you ask." He stepped closer. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he said, "I need to understand something." She waited. "I've spent years around people who wore authority like armor. Some earned it. Most didn't." He folded his arms. "You don't carry yourself like any of them." Leona looked down at the cup in her hands. "That's because I'm not trying to prove anything. That much is obvious." He hesitated, then asked what had been on his mind for hours. "What happened to your team?" The room changed. Not dramatically, just a small shift in stillness. A silence that meant the question mattered. Leona set the cup down. When she looked at him again, her eyes were steady, but older somehow. "We were deployed where systems failed," she said. "Disaster zones, isolated regions, places where hospitals no longer existed or never had." Her voice stayed calm, but there was weight behind every word. "We worked with limited resources, impossible timelines, and people who had already given up hope before we arrived." Dr. Rowan listened without interruption. She continued, "Our mission wasn't just treatment. It was stability, training, building systems where none remained." He nodded slowly. "That matches what I heard." She gave a faint smile. "Most people only heard fragments. What about you?" The smile faded. "I stayed longer than most." A pause. "Long enough to forget what ordinary life looked like." The honesty in that sentence caught him. He lowered his voice. "And then," Leona looked toward the rain-streaked window. "One day I realized I was still doing the work, but I had stopped feeling the purpose behind it." Dr. Rowan said nothing. She went on. "When that happens in medicine, you become dangerous, not because you don't care, but because you stop noticing what care is supposed to feel like." The words settled heavily between them. He understood them more than he wanted to admit. "So you left?" "Yes. Voluntarily." Another pause. "Yes." But the answer came slower this time. Enough for him to notice. There was more. Much more. Yet she offered no details. He studied her carefully. People don't walk away from that kind of unit unless something significant changes. Leona met his eyes. "You're right." He waited. She said nothing else. For a long moment the silence held. Then footsteps passed outside, and voices echoed in the hall. The ordinary sounds of the hospital returned. Dr. Rowan leaned against the counter. "I saw your unit once," he said. She looked at him. "It was during an international response mission. Infrastructure collapse after severe flooding." Recognition flickered across her face. He continued. "There was one field medic, small team lead, if I remember correctly. Calm in a way I couldn't understand." Leona stayed very still. Dr. Rowan narrowed his eyes. "It was you." She did not answer immediately. Then she gave a slight nod. He exhaled. "I thought I recognized your voice." That surprised her. "From all those years ago? You gave me instructions in the middle of a triage corridor while I was trying to argue with your protocols." That brought the faintest smile back. "And did you listen?" "No." She almost laughed. "Then I remember you too." For the first time, the tension between them softened into something close to shared memory. But it did not last, because Dr. Rowan's expression changed again. "I also remember hearing what happened afterward." Leona's face went still. He regretted the words as soon as they left him. But it was too late. He had touched something hidden. "What did you hear?" she asked quietly. He chose his words carefully. "That there was an incident during a later deployment. A critical operation. Some of the team never returned to active service." Her jaw tightened slightly. That was answer enough. He lowered his voice. "I'm sorry." Leona looked away. For the first time that night, her calm seemed thinner. Not broken, just carrying strain beneath the surface. "It wasn't one incident," she said. "It was many. They build over time." She rested both hands on the counter. "You keep moving, keep solving, keep surviving. And eventually you realize the hardest part isn't the crisis." Dr. Rowan waited. "It's coming home and pretending you can become who you were before." The words stayed in the room long after she said them. He understood then that her composure was not natural ease. It was structure, a way of holding herself together. And suddenly the patch made even more sense. It wasn't pride. It was remembrance. A thread connecting her to a version of herself forged in places no one there could imagine. Before he could speak again, a young nurse entered the lounge abruptly. "Doctor, sorry to interrupt. Family consultation in room 7. Dr. Rowan straightened. He looked at Leona once more. There was more to ask. But not tonight. As he moved toward the door, he paused. "Whatever happened back then," he said quietly, "it clearly shaped everyone who crossed your path." Leona gave no response, just that same unreadable expression. But as he left, he heard her speak softly, almost to herself. "Not everyone survived being shaped." The sentence stopped him for half a second. Then he walked on. In the hallway, he found 2 residents whispering near the nurse's station. They fell silent when he approached, but he caught enough to understand. They were talking about Leona. Again, one of them asked carefully, "Sir, who is she?" Dr. Rowan looked back toward the lounge door, then answered with unusual seriousness. "Someone who has already lived through more than most of us ever will." The residents exchanged glances. He added, "And someone you should learn from while she's here." By the time he returned to the trauma floor, the department felt different. Not because of what had been said, but because of what had begun to surface. Leona's past was no longer rumor. It was real. And though she never spoke of it freely, its presence could now be felt in every room she entered. The mystery around her had not faded. If anything, it had deepened. Because now everyone knew one thing for certain. She had not come from ordinary medicine. She had come from places where skill alone was not enough. And whatever she carried from those years was still with her. Hidden beneath calm hands, measured words, and one faded patch stitched to her vest. The rain finally began to weaken just before dawn, turning from heavy sheets into a steady drizzle that blurred the city lights outside St. Aurelia Medical Center. Inside, however, the hospital was still awake. The emergency department never truly slept. It only shifted between levels of chaos and control. By now, the night staff had settled into a quieter rhythm. Some cases were stable. Others were under observation. A few new arrivals came in, but nothing like the earlier wave that had pushed everyone to their limits. Yet even in this calmer state, one presence continued to draw attention without trying. Leona Vale. She moved through the hospital like she belonged to it, but not in the way most staff did. It was not ownership or authority. It was familiarity with pressure, as if she understood the building's emotional weight better than its layout. In the early morning hours, she was seen helping a junior nurse organize discharge instructions for a patient who had been anxious for hours. In another corner, she quietly adjusted an oxygen line for someone recovering from surgery before anyone even asked. She did not announce her actions. She simply acted. Dr. Elias Rowan watched all of it from the central desk. He had not slept. His mind kept returning to what Leona had said in the lounge. Not just the words, but the way she said them. Controlled but not distant. Honest but carefully contained. There was history behind her voice. History that did not sit comfortably in records or resumes. And then there was the patch. That small, worn emblem had become something like an anchor in his thoughts. Every time he looked at her, his eyes drifted to it without permission. It was not just recognition anymore. It was connection. Something about it reminded him of a period in his own career he rarely revisited. Years ago, before St. Aurelia, before he became chief surgeon, he had been part of an international medical response team deployed to disaster zones. It had been a temporary assignment, meant to last a few months. It lasted longer. In those environments, structure was fragile. Hospitals were often tense. Equipment was limited. Decisions had to be made in seconds, not minutes. And the people who worked there were not defined by titles, but by reliability under pressure. He remembered one particular unit that operated differently from the rest. They were smaller, quieter, but when they entered a crisis zone, things changed. Systems that had collapsed started functioning again. Chaos became organized. And at the center of that unit had been a field medical coordinator who never raised their voice, yet somehow everyone listened. He had not seen that person clearly enough to remember their face, but he remembered their presence. And now, standing in his hospital, he was starting to recognize it again. Across the corridor, Leona was reviewing a patient chart when a hospital administrator approached her. The man looked slightly uneasy. He held a tablet and spoke in a careful tone. "Ms. Vale, there's a request for clarification on your credentials." She looked up calmly. "From who?" "Administration review. It's standard when someone joins mid-transfer during an active emergency." She nodded once. "Understood." There was no irritation in her response. Only acceptance. But Dr. Rowan, watching from a distance, noticed something subtle. The administrator's tone changed slightly when he mentioned the review. Not suspicion. Respect mixed with uncertainty. As if even the paperwork could not fully explain her presence. Leona finished reviewing the chart and handed it back. "Everything is correct," she said. The administrator hesitated. "It's not about doubt," he added quickly. "It's just, your background is incomplete in the system." Leona did not react. "That is expected." He blinked. "Expected?" "Yes." Before he could ask anything else, she turned and walked away. Dr. Rowan stepped forward as the administrator left. He approached her in the hallway. "You handled that calmly," he said. "I have handled worse questions." He studied her carefully. "You don't seem surprised by it." "I am not." "Why?" Leona paused for a moment, then said, "Because records don't always follow people who worked where systems failed." That sentence landed heavily. He nodded slowly. "That explains a lot." She looked at him. "Does it?" He hesitated. "No, not everything." A brief silence passed. Then he said, "I spoke with someone from administration earlier. They mentioned your unit again." Leona's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened slightly. "They are curious," she said. "That's one way to put it." He lowered his voice. "I think I've seen your team before. Years ago. Overseas deployment." She looked at him more directly now. "Where?" He thought for a moment. "South Coastal Region. Flood response. Infrastructure collapse." Something in her eyes shifted. Recognition. Not of him. Of the memory. "You were there," she said quietly. "I was." A pause. "I remember a unit that came in after most of the initial response teams were overwhelmed." Leona remained still. Dr. Rowan continued. "They didn't stay long in one place, but I remember how quickly things stabilized after they arrived. Supply chains improved. Patient triage became organized again. It was like someone had restructured the entire response system in real time." Leona's voice was softer now. "That was part of our role." He nodded. "I remember one moment in particular." She waited. There was a temporary field hospital. Overcrowded. Understaffed. Tension was rising fast. People were losing control. He looked at her carefully. And then someone stepped in. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just calmly. Leona did not interrupt. That person redirected the entire triage process in less than 10 minutes. No arguments. No resistance. Just clear instructions that everyone followed. He exhaled. I think that was you. Leona did not confirm it immediately. Instead, she said, it was not about one person. He nodded. I know. It was about coordination. Trust. Yes. Silence settled again. Then she added quietly, trust is easier when people are afraid of the alternative. That statement carried weight. Dr. Rowan looked at her differently now. Not just as a colleague, but as someone shaped by environments where hesitation could cost lives in ways hospitals rarely experienced. I didn't understand that back then, he admitted. Most don't. He folded his arms. You've been carrying that experience for years. I have. And still chose to return here. Leona looked down the corridor. This is not so different. He frowned slightly. It is very different. She shook her head gently. People are still in crisis. Systems still fail. Pressure still reveals character. He considered that, then said, but here you have control. A faint, almost invisible expression crossed her face. Control is an illusion, she replied. That answer stayed between them, because he knew she was right at least in part. In medicine, control was always temporary. Patient stabilized. A system repaired. A moment of calm before the next emergency. Before he could continue, a nurse approached quickly. Doctor, we have a new intake coming in. Possible multi-vehicle incident. Dr. Rowan nodded immediately. Prep Trauma Bay. The nurse left. He turned back to Leona. You should come, he said. She didn't hesitate. I am already coming. They moved together toward the trauma area. As they walked, Dr. Rowan noticed something new. Staff were watching her more openly now. Not with suspicion anymore, but with something closer to recognition. As if the puzzle pieces were slowly forming a picture they did not yet fully understand. In the trauma bay, preparations were already underway. Monitors were checked. Equipment laid out. Teams assembled. Leona stepped in beside him, already assessing the setup. Dr. Rowan glanced at her. You said systems fail. They do. And when they do, people like you step in. Leona looked at him briefly. That is the idea. A pause. But ideas do not always survive reality. Before he could respond, the doors burst open as the incoming case arrived. The conversation ended instantly. The room shifted back into urgency. But something had changed. Not just in the department. In him. Because now he understood something clearer than before. Leona Vale was not just someone who had worked in extreme conditions. She had been part of a system designed to rebuild broken ones. And the reason she remained so composed was not distance. It was experience layered with responsibility. As the trauma team moved into action, Dr. Rowan caught one final glance of her patch. And for the first time, he no longer saw it as a mystery. He saw it as history still alive, still shaping the present, and still quietly influencing everything she touched. The final wave of the night arrived just as dawn began to break through the storm clouds. It was not as chaotic as the earlier emergencies, but it carried a different kind of urgency. A multi-vehicle collision on the highway had sent several injured patients to St. Aurelia Medical Center at once. The trauma unit, already exhausted from the night's events, immediately shifted back into full response mode. Stretchers rolled in. Voices sharpened. Monitors lit up again with warning tones. Dr. Rowan stepped forward without hesitation, taking command of the situation as the doors swung open. Trauma Bay 1 and 2 ready. I need imaging on standby. Blood bank alerted, he ordered. The staff moved quickly. Leona Vale was already at his side, not waiting for instructions, not needing direction. She moved straight to the first patient as soon as the stretcher passed through the doors. Her eyes scanned the condition in seconds. No panic, no delay, just focused assessment. Airway stable, she said calmly. Possible internal injury. pressure dropping slightly. A nurse confirmed her findings. Dr. Rowan noticed it again, the ease with which others trusted her judgment now. It was no longer hesitation or curiosity. It had become instinctive reliance. She worked beside him without interruption, adjusting lines, checking vitals, guiding nurses with short, clear instructions. At one point, a junior staff member hesitated over a medication dose. Leona looked up. "Double-check weight-based calculation," she said gently. "No criticism, just correction." The staff member immediately corrected the error. Dr. Rowan watched everything carefully while continuing his own work. The patient's condition stabilized within minutes. Then another arrived. And another. The rhythm of the department shifted into something intense but controlled. Not chaos anymore. Coordination. At the center of it was Leona. Not dominating the room. Not leading with authority. But holding it together with quiet precision. At one point during the second patient case, Dr. Rowan glanced at her again. Her vest was slightly open at the side from movement. The faded patch was visible once more. It no longer felt like a mystery to him. Felt like evidence. Proof of years spent in environments where failure was not an option. Where systems collapsed and had to be rebuilt in real time. Where people survived because someone stayed calm enough to make it possible. He finally understood what that calm meant. It was not emotional distance. It was discipline built from consequence. After the last of the incoming patients had been stabilized and moved to recovery or surgery, the department slowly began to settle again. The energy shifted from urgent action to controlled exhaustion. Staff leaned against counters, exhaling deeply for the first time in hours. Some laughed quietly from relief. Others simply sat in silence, recovering from the intensity of the night. Leona stepped out of Trauma Bay 3 and walked toward the quieter corridor near the windows. Dawn light was finally visible through the glass. Soft gray light replacing the darkness of the storm. She stood there for a moment, still and quiet. Dr. Rowan followed her after finishing his final check. He didn't speak immediately. He stood beside her, looking out at the city slowly waking up. For a while, neither of them said anything. Then he spoke. "You were right earlier," he said. Leona looked at him slightly. "About what?" "About systems failing." A pause. "They do fail," he continued. "But I think I only understood that in theory before tonight." Leona turned back toward the window. "And now I've seen what it looks like when someone carries the weight of that failure without letting it break them." Her expression softened slightly, though still controlled. "That is not something you carry alone," she said. "It feels like it sometimes." She nodded once. "It always does in the beginning." Dr. Rowan studied her for a moment. There was something different about her now in the morning light. Still composed. Still steady. But not untouchable. Human. He took a breath. "I need to ask you something," he said. Leona didn't look away from the window. "Go ahead." He hesitated. Then asked, "Why come here?" She turned slightly. It was not a defensive reaction. More like she had expected the question eventually. "I was assigned," she said. "That's not the full answer." Faint pause. Then she spoke more honestly. "I requested transfer." That surprised him. "Why?" Leona looked down for a moment. Because for the first time there was a small shift in her composure. Not weakness, but memory. "I stayed in field operations longer than most," she said. "After a while you stop seeing normal hospital work as separate. It all becomes one system, just different conditions." She paused. "But I needed to return somewhere stable enough to remember what healing feels like when the crisis ends." Dr. Rowan listened carefully. "You were losing that?" "I was losing the line between urgency and life." Her voice stayed steady, but softer now. "In the field, everything is urgent. Every decision is immediate. Every delay has consequences. After years of that, you start to believe that calm environments are incomplete." She looked at him. "But they are not." A pause. "They are necessary." That sentence stayed with him, because it reflected something he had seen in younger staff too, the way constant pressure reshaped perception over time. He nodded slowly. So you came back to relearn balance. I came back to remember it exists. Silence returned between them, but it was no longer tense. It felt reflective. Dr. Rowan finally asked the question that had been building since the beginning. That patch, what does it mean to you now? Leona looked down at it. Her hand touched it lightly. For a moment, she did not answer. Then she said, "It reminds me that I was part of something larger than myself." She looked up again. "And that I am still responsible for what I learned there." Dr. Rowan nodded. "I think everyone here learned something from you tonight." She did not respond immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the trauma unit behind them. Staff were still moving, cleaning, finishing reports, checking on patients. Life continuing, even after chaos. "That is good," she said finally. He turned slightly toward her. "You're not staying long, are you?" Leona did not answer right away, and that silence told him more than words could. "I don't know yet," she said eventually. Faint honesty. Not a commitment. Not an escape. Just uncertainty. Dr. Rowan accepted that. Because for someone like her, certainty was never simple. Before either could say more, a nurse approached from behind. "Doctor, final reports are ready when you have a moment." He nodded. "Thank you." The nurse left. He looked back at Leona. "I should go," he said. She nodded. "Me too." But neither moved immediately. There was a pause that felt like closure to a long night. Then Dr. Rowan spoke again. "For what it's worth, I misjudged you at the start." Leona looked at him. "That happens often." He gave a slight, tired smile. "I assumed calm meant distance. And now I think it means control earned through experience." She didn't correct him. That silence was enough confirmation. Finally, she stepped away from the window. "I will finish the shift reports," she said. "I'll review them later." She paused at the doorway, then added quietly, "You did well tonight." It was simple, but coming from her it carried meaning. Dr. Rowan watched her leave. As she walked down the corridor, staff greeted her with quiet respect. Some nodded. Some simply stepped aside. Not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it in a way they could feel but not fully explain. When she reached the exit doors of the trauma unit, she paused briefly. Outside, the storm had fully passed. The city was washed clean by rain, light breaking through the clouds. She looked at the sky for a moment, then adjusted her vest. The patch caught the morning light, faded, worn, but still visible. Then she stepped forward and disappeared into the hallway leading out of the unit. Back into a world that was no longer in crisis, but still carried the echoes of the night. Inside the hospital, Dr. Rowan stood alone for a moment longer. He thought about everything that had happened. The calm, the control, the quiet authority that had changed the tone of an entire department. And he realized something simple but important. She had not come to prove anything. She had come to continue something. Something that did not end when the crisis was over. As the morning shift began to arrive and the hospital slowly returned to its usual rhythm, one truth remained clear in his mind. Some people were shaped by medicine. Others were shaped by survival. And very few were shaped by both. Leona Vale was one of them, and her presence that night had not just helped patients. It had reminded everyone that calm, in its truest form, was not the absence of pressure. It was the mastery of it.